Welcome back to the Information Security Forum podcast. In today's conversation, back with Managing Director Steve Durbin, we're going to be discussing EU GDPR for India. Are you ready to protect your European customers' data? With the main industries in India comprising IT services providers, banks, and conglomerates like Tata Group, Birla Group, Mahindra, and Reliance, who all manage European personal data, they're determining how they're going to comply with the EU GDPR by May 2018. That data privacy issues are being given serious attention has further been compounded by the September 2017 Supreme Court of India's ruling that privacy is a fundamental right. Steve, I guess you have members in India who are relying on the ISF to help them demonstrate alignment with GDPR, so let's get to it. India aims to achieve 25 billion digital transactions in 2017 to 18, so GDPR is going to be extremely important. What are some of the challenges that India may face?
I think one of the things that I'd say, first of all, about the Indian economy is that there is, as you just mentioned, Tavia, this big push towards becoming digitally enabled. And certainly when we look at the kind of businesses, and you mentioned a few of them there, some of which, of course, are ISF members, when we look at the kinds of businesses, they are data intensive. So they do handle a significant proportion of European personal data. For a lot of these enterprises, of course, that does mean that the General Data Protection Regulation clearly is going to apply. The challenge for these companies is really, I think, understanding to what extent it applies, how they are going to manage the data effectively in line with the requirements of the regulation, but also, of course, in line with the requirements of their customers. Because, India for some years now has been certainly very active in outsourcing in terms of call centres, in terms of data management on behalf of European organisations. So I think that complicates things a little bit. But I think that certainly the GDPR will apply. Indian organisations are very actively at the moment examining the implications of that. And I think what certainly a number of our members are doing is applying things like our GDPR implementation guide to walk them through some of those key steps.
One of the questions we're receiving from ISF members in India is, do they need to appoint a DPO? And if they do, what qualifications does the DPO need?
Yeah, the Data Protection Officer is certainly, I think, key to a lot of organisations. Now, if you look at the General Data Protection Regulation, one of the things that it is not that specific about is whether or not every organisation needs to have a DPO. What the regulation has said is that they're going to leave some scope within the regulation for individual member states to determine whether or not a DPO is effectively compulsory. So if you're in the public sector, then certainly it is. But if you're in the private sector, then it's open to some variation. So, for instance, in Germany and Croatia, then the vast majority of organisations there will require a DPO. That's stipulated by the German regulator and the Croatian regulator. In some other countries, for instance, such as the Netherlands and in Sweden, there's an option. If you have a DPO in place, then that means that you don't have to have such a tight relationship with the ICO in those countries. You don't have to inform them as much of some of the ways in which you process data. If we move to looking at data processing in India, then I think that I would say a couple of things. The first is, in the main, Indian organisations process a tremendous amount of personal data on behalf of European clients. Therefore, in my opinion, most Indian organisations would be wise to consider having a DPO. Now, the regulation allows for two things here. Either you can hire one yourself, or indeed you can outsource it. And of course, there are cost considerations to take into account. If you have your own, clearly that DPO is going to have a much better understanding of your business, of the way in which you interact with your customer base, and indeed of some of the requirements. If you outsource it, you may be saving some cost, and also the argument would be that you could bring in experience from other organisations, third parties, and so on, which may benefit you. I think the bottom line around the DPO for most Indian organisations that are handling certainly European data is take a DPO, whether that's on your own books or whether it's outsourced. If you're in the market to hire a DPO, then what are the sorts of skill sets that you're looking for? From an ISF standpoint, DPOs, we recommend anyway, should have at least an understanding of technology, should at least have an understanding of some of the legal requirements of the regulation. But I think more importantly than that, they need to have high emotional intelligence skills. The DPO is going to have to really operate across the organisation. So in some organisations as well, what we're starting to see is that there are very firm links, reporting lines, from departments like marketing, HR, instance, into a DPO. So really it's all about the soft skills for me. There is clearly a large amount of process. There is clearly an understanding of regulatory environment, technology and so on that is required. But to be successful, I think, in that role, you're going to need an attention to detail, an ability to get on with people, and to be able really to ensure that people comply with what in certain instances are going to be fairly significant changes in the way in which data is handled and managed at each and every stage of the information life cycle. So being a DPO, I think, is not an easy option. It's probably not for the faint-hearted, but certainly it's pivotal to the way in which an organisation handles personal information and, more importantly, perhaps demonstrates its compliance with the GDPR to the regulator.
Interesting. What's the best approach for organizations to take to meet the requirements of the EU GDPR?
Well, I think, first of all, we've only got a certain amount of time remaining before organisations need to at least demonstrate that they are on the road to compliance. I'm being very careful about the way that I'm phrasing this. It's unlikely, I think, that organisations that perhaps haven't begun that GDPR regulation compliance journey will have finished it by May. And I think that there is a realism amongst the regulators that that is the case. Certainly, I think you need to have embarked on the journey. You need to have understood the requirements within your business. So you need to have understood and be able to demonstrate that you have a good understanding of where data sits at each and every stage. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you have understood the controls that the regulation requires. You need to have demonstrated that you have in place an impact assessment process to deal with the day when there is a breach or a loss of information. You need to understand as well that that will require not just a compliance approach, but a change potentially in the culture of the organisation. One of the things about GDPR is that, unlike a lot of other compliance-based regulations, it isn't something that just happens once a year. So in May, you aren't just going to get somebody with a clipboard coming in who's going to tick a box and say that's it, and you all breathe a sigh of relief. It is about how you collect and store and manage personal information from here on in, really. Whether that be through the collection of it, through the management of it, or indeed how you destroy that information once it's come to the end of its life. And so if we look at things like marketing departments, sales departments and so on, that's really where some of the challenge is going to come from, because you're talking to people about how they're necessarily going to need to change the way they gather information, the way they gain permission to use that information, and the way that they store that information. And so I think that, going back to the role of the DPO, there is a very strong educational and culture change component, for me anyway, in that particular job. And I think that if you can embrace the GDPR regulation from that perspective, then things really become a lot easier, because you're starting now to sell the benefit of compliance as opposed to having to comply for the sake of compliance.
What benefits can Indian businesses see from meeting compliance requirements with the EU GDPR?
And I think if I look specifically at some of the Indian companies, and some of them have asked me whether or not they ought to be considering this as an area of competitive advantage, my answer to that is that they probably should. I do really think that one of the differentiators will be that they're able to demonstrate a clear understanding of the requirements of GDPR regulation, that they are able to point to the ways in which they are implementing it. And I do think that, smartly positioned, that can be used as something of a competitive differentiator, or at least, in the worst case, is going to allow them to be able to tick the right box when a prospective client asks them, if you're handling my European data, are you compliant with GDPR? So I think it's something that would be ignored at an organisation's peril. But I do think there are some very sound business reasons for embracing it, not just as a compliance-based regulation, but also as an opportunity to enable culture change and perhaps to gain some competitive advantage in what is a highly competitive market space.
Well, as India holds so much sensitive data on behalf of their EU clients and customers, it's imperative, as we're saying, for them to not only get it, but to get it right. If they don't, not only will they become a primary target for cybercriminals wishing to exploit their data, but they'll also be facing fines from the ICO and possibly lawsuits from the organizations they provide services to. Given that the deadline of May 2018 is fast approaching, it sounds like you and I both suggest strongly that organizations needing best practice guidance on how to prepare for the EU GDPR should view the ISF's resources at securityforum.org.